Let's do the Cornel West thing. Let's do it. Man, I'm not gonna enjoy this, man, because I like Cornel. I like Cornel West. But, you know, this is a really, really bad take, and we do need to talk about it. This is what Cornel West said on CNN. Cornel West, for those of you who don't know, is running for president. Originally, he was going to be running on the People's Party ticket. The People's Party is a third party that is... they were involved in organizing the Rage Against the War Machine rally in DC. That's the one I covered on the ground on Twitter. If you guys follow my Twitter account, that had Scott Ritter booked for a period of time before they kicked him out once they, his history of pedophilia was revealed. Had Jackson Hinkle and a bunch of other people come there to condemn the evil aid to Ukraine and to try to stop more American shipments being sent to Ukraine. The People's Party is very, very small. It's not very experienced. And so I said at the time when he partnered with them that, he's working with a party that has very little ballot access. It seems like pretty misguided to bet your campaign on such an inexperienced team. And eventually, it seems like Cornel West was convinced to my persuasion and dropped the People's Party and is now running independent of the People's Party. So he separated himself from them, which the People's Party was not very happy with. And so anyway, putting that all aside, he's running for president of the United States on a third party ticket. So he's not going to win, but maybe he can make some noise. And when people think about third-party ticket campaigns, you need to remember that at the end of the day, a third-party ticket isn't going to win, at least now under the current political paradigm in the United States, under current conditions. The only people that can become president right now is a Republican and or a Democrat. That just is how it is currently. Maybe that'll change in the future. Who knows? But he's running third party, he's making a lot of noise, and he's decided to use his platform, and that's the largest thing you can do as a third party candidate, is use the platform that you try to grow through running for president to bring attention to real issues. He has decided to use the attention he's getting from this campaign to try to stop aid to Ukraine. Cornel West on CNN says NATO provoked Russia's invasion of Ukraine, calls for concessions of territory, oh God, to stop the war, and says the U.S. bears significant responsibility, but adds that he's not pro-Putin, so there's that. Let's listen.
You know how empires behave, Sister Caitlin. If Russia had missiles in Mexico and Canada, the United States government would probably blow them to smithereens, because that's how empires behave. We had the same challenge in Cuba in 1962.
Okay. First off, first off, I want to say, but we don't have missiles in Ukraine. We don't. We don't even have nuclear missiles in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and they share a border with Russia. We don't have nuclear missiles in Finland either. So not only could we not deploy our missiles in Ukraine, because Ukraine's currently not part of NATO, but even if Ukraine did join NATO, that wouldn't necessarily mean we put nuclear missiles in Ukraine. Also, the Soviets did put nuclear missiles in Cuba, and when push came to shove, the hawks in the American government, like Curtis LeMay, lost. We didn't invade Cuba, and we negotiated the removal of those missiles. If we want to talk about a negotiation process between the United States and Russia to negotiate there not being a nuclear Ukraine, we already did that in the Budapest Memorandum. That was the whole point of the Budapest Memorandum, where the Russians and the Americans and the Ukrainians came together and agreed that Ukraine would give up its Soviet-age nuclear arsenal in return for guarantees of territorial sovereignty. Now, that ended up not working out very well for the Ukrainians. Their trust and the Russians ended up backfiring, as the Russians ended up invading them, and the nuclear arsenal that they could have used to defend themselves was gone. Now, I say that with a giant asterisk, because there's a really good chance that even if they didn't accept the Budapest Memorandum, that they couldn't have afforded to upkeep the nuclear stockpile. They couldn't have afforded to, not only hire the staff, but continue to maintain the equipment. And also, we don't know for sure if Ukraine was not only willing to make the financial commitment, but also the long-term strategic commitment for nuclear weapons. I don't want to get too into it, but there's a lot of stuff that says that the Ukrainians might have not agreed to have nuclear weapons anyway. But my point I'm trying to make here is, we already settled this issue, the issue of missiles in Ukraine, when we signed the Budapest Memorandum. This issue's been settled for a while. So there's no issues around missiles in Ukraine. That's not an issue. That's the first thing. The second thing, the Russians put nuclear weapons into Cuba. We didn't invade Cuba. We negotiated the missiles out. So if you want to like recommit ourselves to the principles of the Budapest Memorandum, I'd be happy to do that if that's what it would require for the Russians to leave.
So what we end up with a criminal invasion. And I know some of my left-wing comrades who know it's an invasion, criminal invasion, but a criminal invasion provoked by the expansion of NATO, which is an instrument of U.S. global power. And we have to be able to conceive of a world when we look at China, when we look at Russia, when we look at Ethiopia, when we look at Haiti, when we look at Brazil, we got to see precious human beings rather than these competitive nation states that are trying to devour more profits, more land, and more territory. Can we conceive of such a world?
I could conceive of such a world, but if you're going to conceive of such a world, it sounds like you would be supportive of the, and maybe not the current paradigm of it, but some type of international rules-based international order that could stop nation states from doing that to other nation states, right? And that's very lip-cucky of me to say, but that's, you know, I guess that's one way you could describe it. Also, I am very sick of hearing the line of NATO expansion provoked the Russian invasion, not only because it's reductive, it very much kind of like narrows down the conversation to one element of what caused the Russians to invade, because it wasn't just NATO expansion. I do think that could have been a contributing factor, but I don't think it was the main factors involved. I think Russian nationalism played a very, very large part. Access to resources played a large part. Them wanting military bases in locations like Crimea for the Black Sea Fleet, that played a very large part. There's so many other aspects of this that I think played a larger contributing factor to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Definitely when you consider the fact that when the Russians invaded in 2022, it's not like we did anything particularly provocative. It's not like we said in 2022, okay guys, 5 days until Ukraine's part of NATO. We didn't do that. The French, the Germans, the Hungarians, and the Turks, none of these people were sold on Ukrainian NATO membership, and you need to get, as we found with Finland and Sweden, as everybody's, you know, discovering with this NATO ascension process, with the recent Finnish and Swedish ascension processes, you need to have every single NATO member state agree for you to join NATO. Every single one. Ukraine did not have the agreement of every single one, and due to the foundational principles of the organization, they couldn't join NATO even if they wanted to, and all of NATO kind of wanted them in there because they have a territorial dispute with the Russians. And as long as you have a territorial dispute with another country, the foundational principles of NATO clearly state you cannot join, because if you join, you could drag the entire alliance into an act of war. So there was still a territorial dispute. There were still countries within NATO that didn't want Ukraine to join NATO. Despite the statement in 2008, the situation on NATO membership hadn't changed. So there has to be another element here that Cornel West is not mentioning. Because it can't just be that we did nothing for 8 years since the 2014 invasion, and then all of a sudden the Russians said, you know what, NATO, and then invaded. That extremely reductive. Extremely reductive. You can maybe talk about, well, the Ukrainian military continued to improve and the Russians wanted to invade while the Ukrainian military wasn't at its full potential. It could be resources. It could be military bases. It could be wanting to engage in regime change. It could be hardcore Russian nationalism. As we saw from Putin's speech going into the war, he denied that Ukrainians even have a right to exist, that their people are kind of fake. It's a fake language and a fake culture and a fake people who were artificially created by Lenin. So again, Cornel West, even though he, you know, very intelligent man, scholar, Dr. Cornel West, he seems to have a very reductive, one-dimensional view of what started this war. It's such a small element of it to highlight and to focus on.
Can we pursue such a world? I think we have to. What's at stake? The destruction of the species, the destruction of the planet.
Also, I just want to put this out there. Do you think if you wanted to build an international order where nation states respected each other's sovereignty and we worked together for a better world, do you think it would better de-incentivize nation states from invading and conquering other nation states to have the Russians lose the war, or have the Russians win the war, or annex large swaths of territory? What type of message does that send to tin-bot dictators that want to invade their neighbors? What type of message does that send to people who, you know, want to engage in conquest, loot, and pillaging? Just putting that out there.
The destruction of democracies as we know it.
But
so we're cutting against the grain, but always with a smile.
Practically speaking, what would you accept in Ukraine? Like what? I mean, Trump claims he could fix it in 24 hours. What would that look like for you?
Oh, what I would do, I would bring in the Chinese, the Turks, the African rulers. I would sit down with the Ukrainian leaders and say, we must stop this war, stop these war crimes, the cluster bombs on a variety of different parties, and make sure that we begin a diplomatic process for a just.
Now, this is nitpicky, and I understand, like, I'm principally against cluster munitions as well because of the danger they pose to demining staff, demining workers, and civilians. But the use of war crimes in it, the use of cluster munitions in and of itself isn't a war crime. You can use cluster munitions in a way that is a war crime. The United States is not a signatory to these treaties that I do believe we should be, but technically speaking, it's not a war crime, even if it's still immoral.
Parties, and
which, by the way, like I'm you know what, I don't want to nitpick too much.
Stop these war crimes, the cluster bombs on a variety of different parties, and make sure that we begin a diplomatic process for a just peace. And that just peace is going to have some serious concessions across the board. Russian troops have to leave. There's going to be debates over the territory. There's going to be some kind of concessions over the territory, but
this is the thing. This pisses me off. There's going to have to be some concessions over territory, but also Russian troops have to leave. So Russian troops don't have to leave. This is the problem. You can't say that one commitment is as Russian troops have to leave, but also you have to make concessions on territory. If you make concessions on territory, then the Russian troops aren't leaving. Because if we give them Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, Kherson, and Crimea, which are the current Russian demands, they're going to have troops stationed there to guard it and protect it. Because if they pull out Russian troops from those areas, they're just going to lose them. Kherson is the Ukrainians are going to take it back. They will. Or there could be a ton of car bombings and resistance, which we've already seen right now with tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands active Russian troops deployed out to the field. So imagine the car bombings and all the resistance and all those activities with no Russian soldiers deployed in the area. So they would have to have Russian soldiers in the area to keep the people under their fucking jackboot, right? Which Colonel West is trying to assist them in, doing by giving them land. So number one, it wouldn't be practical for the Russians to pull out all the troops if they wanted to keep part of this territory. But also, the whole principle of getting the Russians out of Ukraine and getting their soldiers out of Ukraine goes away once you give them the territory, because the whole point is we want the soldiers out, stop the occupation. But if they get to keep the land, then the occupation is becoming permanent, legalized, and legitimized by Dr. Cornel West. And I just want to say, all of the violence that Cornel West opposes doesn't necessarily stop because the war stops. These mass graves that were uncovered across the country in many different locations, like, for example, in Izium, over 440 bodies, the largest mass grave since discovered in Europe since the Yugoslav genocide. These happened in a lot of territory where Ukrainian soldiers were not fighting. Where Ukrainian soldiers were not fighting back, where it was just local villagers being villagers. And the soldiers came out, looked for military-age males, looked for anybody with associations with the Ukrainian government, looked for anybody that was dissenting, and they went crazy. And a lot of times it wasn't even people that, stuck out. Sometimes it was just people who were walking down the street, especially when we're talking about the area around Bucha, or around the area around Irpin, where people were getting shot when they were just riding their bike. So just because you stop the war doesn't even necessarily mean you stop the violence. That violence can still continue under occupation, as did violence towards Crimean Tatar Muslim activists in Crimea after the occupation started there, with activists being found dead and bloated down the river days after disappearing for criticizing the Russian government. So just throwing those things out there, Mr. West.
Stop the killing. Why? Because the Ukrainian brothers and sisters are precious, and they are bearing so much of the suffering with this proxy war between the American empire and the Russian Federation.
Man, he is fucking annoying, isn't he? So I don't know how other people use the term proxy war. Problem I have with the term proxy war, and you can call it that if you really, really want to, is it removes the autonomy of the Ukrainian people. And this whole conversation seems to remove the autonomy from the Ukrainian people. It's very much like, we're going to have to give up Ukrainian land. We're going to have to take their land and we're going to split it up, you know, like a colonial power. And we're going to give it to the Russians because the Russians want it. And we just got to do this kind of deal making. I wonder if Cornel West would have done this with the Algerians and in the French. Oh, well, you know, this French colonialism's bad and everything, but do we really think these Algerian rebels can win? You know, to stop the suffering of the Algerians, I say they give up half Algeria to, like, the French. Then I think they should, you know, compromise a little, you know? Compromise on the freedom, compromise on the liberation. Like, if we, like, South Africa, like, okay, how about we, you know, we make half of South Africa unsegregated, and we get rid of apartheid in half of South Africa, or just apply this logic anywhere else. And I feel like Dr. Cornel West, who is somebody who's, you know, very strong on issues of civil rights, very strong on issues of economic injustice, if you put any other issues in front of him, like, his ability to compromise is going to probably go way down. He's not going to compromise a $15 minimum wage. He's not going to compromise on anti-union laws. He's not going to compromise on a ton of other pieces of legislation. But when it comes to compromising on the Ukrainian people's freedom, and it comes to compromising on their own willpower and ability to fight against the Russian invasion, he's perfectly willing to compromise on that. Also, if you're going to talk about a people suffering, if you're going to talk about a people dying in the way that he's talking about the Ukrainian people, and he needs to help the Ukrainian brothers and sisters, does legalizing and legitimizing their occupation help those Ukrainian brothers and sisters? We're seeing in Ukrainian and Russian occupied territory in Ukraine, people are getting threatened with deportation, of losing their property rights, and they're trying to punish them and arrest them for not taking Russian passports, for not even getting in the way of the Russian occupation, but actively not assisting it, is something that can make you lose your property rights and lose the homes that you've lived in for 30, 40, 50 years. So they deport you, kick you out of the country, and then give your home to Russian settlers. If we applied this scenario anywhere else, I really feel like the type of rhetoric that Cornel West was saying would be completely different. If this was the United States doing this in any other country in the world, it would be, America must withdraw unilaterally, completely, and stop this war of aggression, stop this imperialism. But we're not seeing that unyielding passion on the side of the Ukrainians. Just the passion for making them accept permanent occupation.
So there's responsibility and blame across the board, but the American empire does bear a significant responsibility here, even though it's not the sole or exclusive responsibility, and it's in no way a pro-Putin. People say, oh, you must.
I mean, I don't care if he's pro-Putin, but his position is indistinguishable from an American's position who would be pro-Putin when it comes to the policy prescriptions. I mean, that might be, you know, not very nice to say, but it's also true that if you were a pro-Putin, pro-invasion Russian nationalist in the United States who believed Ukrainians were cockroaches, you would be asking for the same thing Cornel West is. Yes, give up some territory. Yes, pull out any idea of NATO expansion into Ukraine. Ukraine should not get any defensive agreements. And there's another question for Cornel West, because I at least appreciate Cornel West for one thing in this interview, and that is when asked how he would negotiate peace, because other people will just say, oh, we'll just bring everybody to the table. And at first it sounded like that was what he was doing. He was like, oh, we'll get the Turks, we'll get the Chinese, we'll get the African, we'll get everybody. We'll just bring everybody together and kumbaya and like bring peace. Instead, he says, no, this is actually what we're going to give up. So I appreciate him biting the bullet and at least saying, this is how we're going to get peace right now, and it's by fucking over the Ukrainians. I appreciate the honesty in that. But But even though I appreciate that honesty. Wait a second. Sorry, I got a message. Okay, it's in StreamYard. Okay, sorry. Okay, even though I appreciate that honesty, there's an element here that he's not talking about. And this is the big thing that a lot of people don't have an answer to, and I think Cornel West probably also doesn't have an answer to it. How do you stop the Russians from invading again? Let's say we go with Cornel West's plan. The Ukrainians obviously outraged that they have to give up Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporozhye, or even if they're just giving up Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk. Like, it would already be unbelievably hard deal for them to swallow. But let's say we force that down their throat. Maybe Zaporozhye, Kherson too. Who knows? Maybe we just freeze the line of contact. That's probably what the Russians would demand, that they freeze the line of contact, right? They would probably first demand more than that, say more territorial concessions. And depending on how inexperienced Cornel West is in this type of stuff, who knows what he's going to do? And who knows how much he's going to include the Ukrainians in these negotiations? Because the Ukrainians are going to be raising hell the entire time that this is even happening in the first place, and the idea of them giving up their territory is being entertained. But let's say everything's done and over with. What is he going to do if the Russians just invade again? Because the Russians invaded in 2014, and we did really nothing, right? Russians invaded 2022. We've started to do something, but now Cornel West is like, no. Do nothing. Just negotiate. Pull back the weapons. No. What if the Russians just invade again? Is the solution going to be the same thing next time? Like, okay, well, last time we gave them Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye. Now let's also give them Kharkiv. Now let's also give them Odessa. Now let's also give them this. What is going to be the leverage that the Ukrainians have if they're not putting them in NATO, since he's complaining about NATO expansion? What is the leverage we're going to give the Ukrainians that's going to stop the Russians from invading again? Is it going to be the United States making a defensive alliance with the Ukrainians? But he's also saying he doesn't want these like alliances like spreading into Ukraine. If we're going to make this type of deal with the Russians, which we shouldn't in the first place, what is he going to do to make it so the suffering that he's going to inflict upon the Ukrainian people by making them accept this occupation permanently? What is he going to do to make it worthwhile so that they have security guarantees that makes it worth it? Instead of just being like, you know what? Even if America doesn't support us, we're going to struggle on. We're going to do it with a lack of air support, a lack of anti-air power, because we don't have a choice, because it's either the death of our nation, it's either the death of our nation or victory. Because without a defensive alliance, without something to disincentivize another Russian invasion, the Russians just invade again in 5-6 years. And then without all of this territory that the Ukrainians used to have, without this coastline, it's going to be very hard for them to rebuild up their country. It's going to be really hard for them to prepare a defense. It's going to be difficult. It's not easy when you give up a fifth of your territory. Think about how much of the economy that's being given up. Think about how many people are being given up to occupation. Think about how many people have lost their jobs. Think about how many people have lost their homes. How much productive capacity has been lost. How many farms have been lost. You're going to be permanently making Ukraine somewhat weaker and possibly still keeping them out of the alliance structure. I need to hear from him what he would do about Ukraine being in an alliance, whether they would be in NATO, but he's complaining about NATO membership, so I doubt that would be the case, or what he would propose otherwise. Because if his position is just concede to the Russians and trust they don't invade again, then that's just moronic, and he should be laughed out of the room. This is already a really bad segment, but if he doesn't have an answer for that, then he's just peace and love hippie, and that's just, he's just purely operating off of vibes.